All right, so I am not a doctor. I'm not a nurse. I am not a paramedic, not in the military. But I do know something about trauma. The one thing I do know is that there's the golden hour, right? And Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock is the golden hour, right? Is that how it works? So I want to speak to you a little bit about weapons of mass destruction. That is my world, and I'll explain how we look at weapons of mass destruction from an FBI standpoint. I did find a quote that hopefully will ring true with some of you from Dr. Woodward. When you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras. That has great application in the medical world, correct? For me, my job is to think of the zebras. I need to look outside of what might be apparent in front of us and decide, is this something bigger than what we're seeing on paper? So within the FBI, we have 56 field offices around the United States and 70 or so smaller offices in embassies around the world. And in each of those 56 field offices, we have an individual like myself who is a weapons of mass destruction coordinator. And my job is pretty much threefold. I deal with preparation and planning. I deal with the response and investigation and intelligence gathering against weapons of mass destruction threats. And I'm also responsible for the implementation of PPD 25. That basically says the FBI is in charge of WMD events that occur in the country, but not for a second will I say that the FBI does this alone. It is absolutely a team effort between federal agencies, local, state, tribal, and our private and other public sector partners that play a key role in the response to incidents that occur. So what's a WMD look like? Well, as we look around the world, we can see the use of chemical weapons in Syria, fires at chemical plants due to earthquakes. We have the Tsarnaev brothers in Boston at the Boston Marathon bombing in the upper right corner there. We have a hazmat situation at the U.S. Capitol involving anthrax, or a suspicious powder that's found at an office of a U.S. senator. And then the bottom right corner up there, we have a fire that resulted in a massive explosion at a fertilizer plant in Texas. Are all of these criminal events? Some are not, some are, and that's our job to try to figure that out in concert with our partners. So when I look at a WMD event, I try to say, how can I prevent something from happening in the future? How do we work together to do that? In a typical crime, we look at who's the bad guy. So I say, is there one particular thing that stands out about someone that conducts a WMD attack? Well, all of these individuals that you see on the screen did conduct WMD attacks by statute here in the United States. So there's no solid profile of what a terrorist or a WMD subject looks like. Our job and my job in the WMD world is to look at the modalities. So by modalities, I mean the chemical, the biological, the radiological, the nuclear, the explosive material that was used. For our military folks, the Siberni, right? And then my job is to then try to set up tripwires in the community that can help to tip us off when one of these people is out building or conducting pre-attack surveillance or things like that prior to carrying out that attack. All right, so I mentioned Siberni, the chem, bio, rad, nuke, and explosive. And I also mentioned that we have 56 of myself around the country, 56 people like me, not myself, right? Again, I'm not a doctor, but my handwriting looks like one. You could just, yeah, anyway. Wow, it's late. So if we look at the X and Y axis there, on the Y axis, we're looking at the likelihood of someone using a particular material. On the X axis, we're looking at their access to that material. And because we have limited resources, I have to try to decide where are we going to focus our investigative efforts. Thanks to our military and other contract partners, our nuclear stockpile is secure. The ability to make a nuke here in the United States it's really hard. It's really hard. That doesn't mean I ignore that completely, but we're going to focus our efforts a little bit in other places. Chemical weapons, again, very difficult. If I want to make certain chemical weapons, I need chemicals, things like thiodiglycol, for instance, and we have relationships with those companies around the country that sell those chemicals. And if you're not a registered buyer with their company, most likely I'm going to get a phone call, or the WMD coordinator in that particular city or state is going to get a phone call, and you'll probably get a visit from us saying, hey, why do you need this? Are you trying to make mustard agent or something along those lines? As we go further up that threat, we begin to get things that are more likely that are occurring here in the United States or have occurred. Radioisotopes. You work in medicine, you know that they're important in medicine. We have radiological materials used in blood irradiators or in gamma knives, whatever the case may be there. Biological pathogens and toxins. We have endemic pathogens here in Arizona and throughout the country, whether that's Francisella tularensis or Yersinia pestis or anthrax, things that are naturally occurring throughout the country that someone could get a hold of. And then industrial chemicals. Up and down the highways all around us and on the railways and on our shipping channels, we have industrial chemicals that are being shipped. We have access to them at stores throughout the country. And then finally, explosives. These are the things that we see the most, especially here in Arizona at the moment. We're seeing individuals that mess around, that's a technical term there, mess around with toxic industrial chemicals and with explosives. So when I look at chemical threats, we break them into three things. We look at explosive precursor chemicals, toxic industrial chemicals or TICs, and chemical warfare agents. The last time a really successful chemical warfare attack happened was with Aum Shinrikyo in Tokyo on the subway. They spent a lot of money, about $2.5 million, to make the sarin that they deployed, resulting in the deaths of 12 people and many others injured. Like I said, we have tripwires set up to try to stop people from getting the chemicals necessary to do those things. But as we work our way up, we know about TICs. Our military friends know that over in theater in Iraq, for instance, there's a lot of one-ton chlorine containers out there. And when you strap some explosives to it, we've then sent chlorine out onto the battlefield and we're back into the world wars with trench warfare. Could someone do that here? Well, absolutely, and I'll talk about an incident here in Arizona. And then explosive precursor chemicals. Still to date, the worst act of domestic terrorism on U.S. soil was the Oklahoma City bombing, the result of industrial fertilizer and fuel oil put together in a massive bomb that created huge havoc there in Oklahoma City. Now, for you, why am I here with you as trauma professionals and in the first responder community? Well, you're the eyes and ears of me as the individual, the one guy here in Arizona that's trying to lay the groundwork of tripwires and stop this from happening. So what have we seen and what can you be on the lookout for? The individual on the left there, that's in Pakistan, and if you look closely at his fingers, you'll notice that they're bright white. Concentrated hydrogen peroxide will burn your skin, as you probably know from your chemistry classes in college. Concentrated hydrogen peroxide is necessary to make what we call the mother of Satan, or TATP, triacetone triperoxide, the most popular explosive among terrorists these days. So if we have someone that's messing around with it, and again, messing around the technical term, making an explosive with it, and they injure themselves, and they present themselves at a hospital or another medical facility, and they have those chemical burns on their hands, that's a time when I'd like to get a phone call from you as appropriate, and then work with you to determine what's really going on. Does his story for what's going on make sense? There's a whole list of chemicals that are necessary in order to make explosives, and the FBI teaches classes around the country on this, and I invite you to reach out to your WMD coordinator in the city or state where you're located, for those of you watching online, and we'll work to try to get you into one of those classes on explosive awareness and the chemicals that can be used. I mentioned a case here in Arizona. There's a gentleman named Todd Russell Fries down in Tucson, and Todd Russell Fries owned a power washing company. And one of his clients wasn't very happy about the job that they did, so they didn't pay him. So, of course, what do you do when someone doesn't pay you for doing your job? You try to kill him, right? So Todd Russell Fries went down to the hardware store and bought 3 of those 5-gallon buckets full of chlorine tablets. And here in Arizona, obviously, we have a lot of chlorine tablets for sale. And he probably spent about $200, got that and got an acid, and he mixed those together, and he created a chlorine cloud the size of a football field. And lucky for us, this was in the summertime in an area of Tucson where there were a lot of snowbird residences, so people weren't there, the houses were buttoned up tight, but this mile-long, this football field size chlorine cloud went for over 3 miles. And we had first responders that drove through it to go heroically rescue the family that were inside that house. But can you imagine the devastation, the injuries that would be present if that had been done at a different location, somewhere at a special event, somewhere in the country, or heaven help us, here in Phoenix? But that's the reality of what we see, and it's happening not too far from home. Now, I mentioned biologicals. The most common thing that we've seen here domestically has to do with the biological toxin ricin. And that may or may not have to do with something involving a popular TV show a few years ago where the main character made ricin in order to kill a rival. May or may not. I'm not allowed to mention the name in a public arena. However, the castor seeds that you see up in the top there, that's how you extract the ricin. You extract the ricin from those seeds. And it's a biological toxin. And what it does is when it gets inside of you, it prevents your cells from making the proteins that they need, so in the end you die. You can inhale it, you can ingest it, you can inject it. If you inhale it, obviously it's going to cause respiratory distress, fever, coughs, nausea. Eventually fluid builds up in the lungs, other organs begin to shut down. If you ingest it, there'll be vomiting, diarrhea. These are all things that you see on a daily basis when people come to the ER, right? How do we know that it's ricin? Well, we'll talk about how we can work together to try to determine that. And other things, as I mentioned, there's other endemic pathogens that occur here in the U.S. and around the world. Things that we don't see very often, fortunately. Bacillus anthracis, variola major, smallpox. Fortunately, that's been all but eradicated. Hopefully, it's still locked up in the freezers at a couple of key locations around the world. The plague is making a resurgence, we know, in Eastern Africa and Madagascar. We have plague endemic here in Arizona, in the fleas up north. In the prairie dog population, we see die-offs yearly because of the plague. And occasionally we see individuals that present at hospitals that are suffering from the plague because of the Yersinia pestis. And fortunately, most often they're treated and released after a short time. Botulism, still to this day, the most toxic substance known to man in the opinion of many, in my opinion. Again, I'm not a doctor, just play one up here on behind the podium. But again, I'm thinking zebras, not the horses, when somebody presents with things. Are you aware? Are you paying attention to the potential? I work to try to determine every time I get a phone call that someone's been diagnosed with the plague. Was it a nefarious act? Was it an accident? Because I need to determine, do we have a bigger problem here than what we're just seeing? We talk radiological exposure. Probably the most famous radiological exposure incident, deliberate radiological exposure incident, occurred to Alexander Litvinenko in London. Now, he used to work for the Russian FSB, formerly the KGB. He defected to London. He wrote a book talking rather negatively about the Russian government. And according to the courts in London, the FSB sent a couple of gentlemen over to London to kill Litvinenko, and they wanted to make an example of him. So they poisoned his tea with polonium-210. And polonium-210, that's an alpha emitter, primarily an alpha emitter. It's a very active alpha emitter. And we know from, if you took science classes involving radiation, that alpha particles, they're stopped by pieces of paper, they're stopped by skin, but they're a real big problem if you ingest them and get them inside, and they begin to attack you from the inside. They have a real short half-life, 138 days, so they're really hot. They're giving off a lot of alpha. Well, in November 2006, Litvinenko fell ill, and he thought he had the flu, and it got worse and worse and worse, and finally his wife said, we need to go to the hospital. They went to the hospital, and it wasn't until about 3 weeks later, after doing a number of tests, that they determined that he had been poisoned with a radioactive material. So he was showing, he had severe diarrhea, vomiting, all of these things. And he had ingested 200 times the LD50, the lethal dose of polonium-210. And it was in that teapot where they'd poured it in there at the restaurant while they were meeting with him. So how do we work together? How when someone presents with some strange symptoms, signs and symptoms, do we work together to help to determine what actually caused this, and should the FBI or other law enforcement be involved? The FBI has what we call our joint criminal and epidemiological investigation model. And the keys to that model is that between epidemiologists, public health, the first responder community, law enforcement, we need to be in communication, whether that's through formal or informal networks, through memorandums of understanding. We need to build that level of trust where you feel comfortable picking up the phone and calling the FBI and knowing that we're going to be a partner in this, and we're not going to send up the flags right away. We're not going to have the black helicopters fly over and do all of that. We're going to work together to determine, was this an accident or was this a deliberate incident that occurred? There's challenges to it. What are those triggers? What are the thresholds that are required to call and say, hey, law enforcement, I'm concerned about this. This is odd. These burns on this person's hand are not making sense with what they're saying happened. You've all had incidents where someone came into the hospital and said, I tripped and fell on the knife, and I got stabbed by the knife 10 times. It's definitely not my spouse's fault, right? It's the same thing with WMD. What is that trigger to give us a call? Sometimes we can give too much information, sometimes we give too little. There's the HIPAA rules. The HIPAA is very, very important, but there are exceptions to HIPAA. There are law enforcement and exigent circumstance exceptions to HIPAA, where you know that when you give us information, we promise to protect that limited information that you're giving us in order to conduct our investigation. And you can, again, reach out to me or to the WMD coordinator in your city, and we'll talk through what the HIPAA exceptions are and explain to you what we do with that information. And the other challenge that we have is, who's the true expert? Like I said, I am not the true expert on many things. I have studied a lot since I got my C in chemistry in high school to try to make up for that difference. So when I come across something that is of concern, I go through what's called our threat credibility evaluation process. It's a 3-phase process where I look at 3 things. I look at the technical feasibility of a threat. I look at the operational practicality of a threat. And I look at the behavioral resolve, or the adversarial intent. And when I combine that with the intelligence picture, I determine whether or not we have a credible threat. So what does that look like in real life? Someone calls into the Joint Terrorism Task Force where I work, and they say, hey, I have a friend who says he wants to poison the water tower with ricin. I say, okay, well, let's talk about how big is this water tower? They say, well, it's 1 million gallons of water. All right. I don't know a whole lot about ricin, but I conduct a threat credibility evaluation, which includes a conference call with PhD microbiologists and chemists back at the FBI laboratory and at some of our government partner labs around the country. And we get them on the phone and we say, hey, if I've got 1 million gallons of water, how much ricin is it going to take to affect people downstream? And they say, well, it's going to take 1 metric ton of ricin poured directly into that water tower to affect people downstream, because our fire friends will tell you that dilution is a solution, right, Dan? So, is that technically feasible? It is if you can make 1 ton of ricin, right? Well, my tripwires in the seed communities are going to call me and tell me, hey, Agent Bates, you know what? There's a guy that's bought 500,000 pounds of ricin, of castor seeds, and you might want to go talk to him, which I will do. Is it operationally practical? No. No, we know it's not operationally practical. No one's going to be able to make that much. You can have all the behavioral resolve in the world, but it's not going to happen. So we go through that process on a near daily basis here in this country in order to evaluate potential threats. So when you call into the FBI or you call into local law enforcement regarding a concern that someone has been exposed to something, we will go through this process. Is it realistic? Is it technically feasible that this person was exposed to that causative agent doing what they said they were doing? Is it operationally practical that someone could have deployed that particular material and resulted in what happened? It doesn't mean we're not going to investigate if we deem that a threat is not particularly credible. Threatening to do something is still against the law, but it will tamp down what our response might look like. So I've run over a lot of information today. I could talk for hours about weapons of mass destruction, and in the future I want to do more work with you in the medical community on awareness regarding the signs and symptoms of WMD exposure. As was said by the last speaker, thank you for what you do. My sister, my brother-in-law are both RNs, and the nice thing about the work that you do in hospitals is that I feel like we have a similar relationship to law enforcement in that a lot of times it's thankless. And so I appreciate the relationship. I hope we can continue to work on that relationship, and I'll be happy to answer questions afterward if you have any. Thank you.